dedicated to vaccine passports. The first one was a discussion between philosophers about the main ethical issues raised by vaccine passports. And today we'll be looking at another set of issues, lawmaking and scientific uncertainties. So indeed, many people were hugely disappointed when, while many vaccines were approved by health authorities and immunization programs were energically implemented, when some governments were very hesitant, if not absolutely reluctant, about the idea of a vaccine passport. At the same time, other governments, like in Denmark, for instance, were very much in favor of such a system. In the public sphere, there was much talk about the uncertainties about how COVID-19 interacts with vaccination. So were the politicians too cautious? Was the behavior of the virus too difficult to predict and its mutations too numerous to allow vaccinated people to travel, to go to the cinema or to the pub in full safety? Was there, or were there too much uncertainties to allow a sound lawmaking on vaccine passports? So to address these questions, we are very happy to welcome Professor Christine Rollier and Professor Timothy Endicott. And many thanks to both of them to accept to speak in the seminar today. So Professor Christine Rollier is a member of the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Oxford. She is a senior research scientist in vaccinology at the Oxford Vaccine Group, leading the novel vaccine development team. She's involved in the creation, design, preclinical and early clinical studies of new and improved vaccines against bacterial diseases and infectious diseases affecting children mainly. And currently, our research deals with the conception, the design, the preclinical and the early clinical development of new and improved vaccines against particularly respiratory viruses. Today, she will address the relevance of scientific uncertainties for the design and use of vaccine passports. We'll learn, for instance, about the difference between having an immune response against a pathogen and having immunity against the infection, as well as what is the meaning of and impact of varying vaccine efficacy. Professor Timothy Endicott is a Vinerian professor of English law at the University of Oxford. He's a member of All Souls College. Professor Endicott is a specialist of constitutional and administrative law and jurisprudence. He's especially interested in law and language, as well as legal interpretation. He's the general editor of the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies. Today, he will address, in particular, the reluctance of politicians to allow certificates of vaccination against COVID-19. He will question the role of scientific uncertainties in lawmaking. So we'll hear first Professor Rollier and then Professor Endicott. As we will be recording the session, please would you be kind enough to turn off the videos in order to facilitate the recording. And now we can start, and Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. Oh, I can't share my screen. Can you allow it? It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Yes, I think Anne-Sophie can allow the screen sharing.
You should be fine now.
Yeah. Presenter view. Hopefully you can all see it in presenter view. Oh,
excellent, we can. Yeah, very good.
No, not good. It starts with the conclusion.
Well, we can't see very well.
That was not the aim. I'm sorry for that. I'll try to stick to the time, but I didn't aim to be that short. Let's try again. Is that right?
Yes. Very good.
Right. So, and trying to explain in this talk the relevance of scientific uncertainty for the design of the vaccine passport. And first of all, I think it's really important to make the definitions of what are the questions that people that want to use or make the vaccine passport, what are they asking the scientists? So first, what is it that we want? We want to identify the people that have a certain degree of immunity. And immunity is the ability to resist an infection. I'm going to try and have a mouse here. Can you see my mouse? The pointer?
Yes, we can. Yeah,
excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. So this ability to resist an infection, actually, the definition of that is not that simple, because you can have a sort of a varying degree of resisting to the infection. And the first one is identifying the people that are at low risk of acquiring SARS-CoV-2 infection, and that is called protection from infection, relatively simply. But you can also aim for identifying the people that have low risk of illness, and that is protection from disease. And that does mean that actually the virus is, despite vaccination, is still able to come in, but gives an asymptomatic disease, let's say. And that is good enough for a vaccine, actually. And the third aspect I want to highlight is you may, when you do have protection from disease, you may also be able to transmit the disease. And does that matter? I think it does, and it does actually matters quite a lot for the vaccine passport, and I'll try to explain that throughout the presentation. So in my mind, I sort of group these two kinds of protection as a personal protection. So you have a vaccine passport that's going to tell, or you try to design a vaccine passport that's going to tell that you are at low risk of getting infected or of getting very sick, and that's a personal protection. And there's also the aspect of protecting the society. So for example, you have protection from disease, so you don't need to go to the doctor, or you don't go to the hospital, and you don't overwhelm the hospital, and that depends obviously on the symptoms. And the risk of transmitting the disease is potentially what is the most important, because you then protect other people in the society by having the protection, the vaccine passport, or the immunity induced by infection. You are not potentially transmitting to other people that are not vaccinated, or you are not allowing the emergence of new variants. And so you can see how that society protection differs from the personal protection. And actually each of these ability to resist the infection might be driven by different kind of immune responses. So already I'm having a scientific approach of telling you it's more complicated than you think, and I'm sorry for that, but it is. Second question is how do we get that immunity, that ability to resist an infection? Which of that? Next slide, is actually two events, either by a vaccination or by infection. And that's why for me, it's a bit curious to talk about vaccine passport when maybe what we want is an immunity passport. And a good example is obviously Israel, where in their passport, they include people who have had a vaccine and also people who have had an infection, because that can give obviously immunity. And the third question, whether it's relevant or not, and I'll go through that, is how do we detect, or how do we identify these people that have immunity? So you have different ways to do this. And one way is to have a lab test and confirm that people have immunity. If you have a correlate of protection, I'll explain that. Or you can identify an event, and the event obviously is either the vaccination or the infection. So hopefully I have sort of made the definition of all the aspects that can be considered for the vaccine platform. So first of all, I want to clarify also that an immune response is not equivalent to immunity. And the terms can be used and somewhat misused, not wanting to criticize the media, but it can be misused and misinterpreted. And that distinction between immune response and immunity is true whether the immune response is induced by infection or vaccination. In this schematic, all I want to show is not to go into the detail, but basically in your immune system, you have several components. And what matters really is what is in red here, is the immune system, when it encounters a pathogen or it encounters a vaccine, it's going to induce these responses, antibodies, and what we call cellular responses, T-cell responses. And these constitute an immune response, right? However, these don't necessarily protect you against the infection. It depends whether they are functional. What is their function? Can they actually prevent the infection from starting in your body, or once it starts, eliminate it or make it lower? And that really is the difference between an immune response, you have antibodies, and immunity, your antibodies actually work, actually do the job of protecting against the infection. So in the next slide, I explain that a bit more in detail. So the one example of inducing immune response, the body inducing immune responses which do not correlate with immunity, you have several natural infections where you have very good immune responses that are induced, but there is very limited or no protective immunity. For example, papillomavirus, and it's a good example because actually we have a vaccine or a couple of vaccines that actually induce a better response than the natural infection. So that's why I quite like this example. But for example, the gonococcus, you can have the infection and then be reinfected again and again. So the infection, despite this first infection or the second, inducing an immune response, this immune response is not capable of blocking another infection. So relevant to this talk, to this topic today of coronaviruses, what we know of 4 other human coronaviruses that circulate every year, and we've all have encountered them in our lives, and probably many times in our lives, in each of them, is that they induce, they get cold every winter, basically. And they induce what is thought to be a relatively short-lived protection, maybe a year. But for example, another coronavirus called MERS has been suggested to induce, once you're infected with it, to induce a protection that lasts for 2-3 years, right? So you can see that just having had the infection does not mean that you're not going to get the infection again. Whether the immune response is induced by a vaccine or by an infection, it does not always protect against the infection for different reasons. For example, when you have a variable pathogen, and for example, flu is a good example. You have to have a different vaccine almost every year. And of course, that's the case for SARS-CoV-2. We've now all heard about the variants of concerns emerging, and the worry whether a previous infection is actually protecting you against the variants of concern or not, and especially for the vaccine, if they protect you against the existing or the future variants of concern. This point here about protection, a sort of threshold, I wanted to sort of explain the concept of correlate of protection. And a good example is SARS-CoV-2. So what we consider the closest correlate of protection, or a sort of measurement of a function of an immune response that seems to correlate with protection, is the level of neutralizing antibodies. Sorry for the AB here, it means antibodies. So you may have neutralizing antibodies, and they are able to actually block the virus from entering into the cells. But in your body, you may need a certain amount of these to actually protect you. So if you're over the threshold, you might be protective. And when it starts to go under the threshold, you're not protected anymore. You still have some antibodies, but they're not protected. And that's what we call a correlate of protection, when we know that threshold in a particular assay, and we're lucky in a disease if you actually have one clear correlate of protection. That's not yet known for SARS-CoV-2. And the other, I think probably the most important point is the persistence of this immune response that protects you. If the response is wane over time, and it's very difficult to predict. For example, if you get infected by measles, your protection is through your whole life. If you get infected by chickenpox, your antibodies to chickenpox probably protects you for 50 years. If you get a tetanus vaccine, the antibodies against the tetanus toxin probably protects you for 10-15 years on average. And some other vaccines are shorter than that, 5 years or 2 years. And so you can see immediately that this persistence going to be quite impacting on the vaccine, on the concept of vaccine platform passport. Last but not least is the degree of protection induced by either infection or vaccine is not 100%. And that's not abnormal here for COVID. And I just wanted to take the example here of the BCG, which is the vaccine probably given in the whole world, but we still have a lot of TB disease. The flu vaccines efficacy vary from very, very low efficacy some years to high efficacy. It can vary from 20 to 70% efficacy depending on the year. The malaria vaccine, for example, RTSS was 30 to 40% efficacious. In this particular case of COVID-19 vaccines, there are quite a few vaccines now available, and you've all seen the varying vaccine efficacies that have been published, either from the clinical trials or from real life information, and it varies basically from 60 to 95%. And how does that actually affect the vaccine passport? Are you happy when you have 60% protection, right, versus a 95%? So you certainly don't want to design your vaccine passport to be dependent on the vaccine that you have received. It becomes a level of complexity that's probably quite unwelcome. And of course, what is the protection induced from previous infection? And you'll see that it's probably around the same numbers or maybe higher. So just to come back to that slide, I should have put that slide again when I said, how do I identify these people that are low risk of getting infected or of transmitting? You have either have the lab test or the event. And the lab test for correlates of protection, which is the neutralizing antibody, is very technically challenging. It's difficult in a scientific setting. It's very expensive, time consuming. This is not something that can be done in large scale at the moment. You could also take a lab test for the immune response. As I mentioned, it does not necessarily say that you are protected, but these are easier actually to do, and there's a lot of actually, I call it lab tests, but they are easy tests to detect antibodies now for COVID-19, but they still remain costly at large scale. And also, how do you make sure people have done it properly to detect that? So really the vaccine platform, and also I suppose it's because that's why it's called a vaccine passport instead of an immunity passport, is you actually identify an event, which is either the vaccination or the infection. And the point that I'm going to make throughout my presentation is that you have to use conservative estimates of the efficacy of the protection that it gives. Right. So this is actually illustrating what I just said, is these graphs show the virus neutralization and the efficacy obtained in a study that is actually one of the Oxford Vaccine Group study. So the data can be looked by anyone on this publication. On this left graph, you can see the result of the virus neutralization assay. So that's basically the closest to correlate of protection that we have for COVID-19 at the moment. And on the x-axis, you can see the interval between prime boost. It's not of importance here. All I want to show is that you have, with different intervals, you have an increasing levels. Each dot is a person, basically, is the result per person. So with increasing intervals, you have increasing levels of neutralizing antibodies. So as a reminder, these antibodies are actually capable in the lab to prevent the entry of the virus into the target cell. And here on the right in this paper, my colleague Mrna Vaccine, who's an excellent statistician, what she looked at is the vaccine efficacy. So that's really is what you want to know for the passport. Correlating, and that the graph correlates with the neutralization titer. And you can see that when the neutralization titer increases on the right of the graph, your vaccine efficacy increases. And so you can take the virus neutralization as a sort of correlation or predictor of your vaccine efficacy. However, in this slide, also what these two graphs illustrate is that what we can use as scientists to inform a vaccine passport is actually the real life data, the vaccine efficacy, for example, in a trial or like the Scottish study after immunization in the population. And also we can use the correlate to inform the estimates of protection. And you'll see in some of my slides why I mentioned that is because I'm going to show you information on the virus neutralization. And of course, we're going to assume that that relates to some efficacy. So what do we know about the immunity induced by infection? And maybe I should apologize for having that slide here because the topic is vaccine passport. And I think I made it clear that are we talking about vaccine passport, in which case we are excluding people that have been infected and probably are, or at least partially protected, or an immunity passport. So on immunity induced by infection, and actually on the topic of vaccine passport, I highly recommend that paper, Brown et al. From 2021. What is known is that most symptomatic infection induce antibody responses, including the neutralizing antibodies that I've highlighted that are important. What we know is that the antibody levels wane within a few weeks, but the responses remain higher than pre-infection levels. There is no known level of response, even in the neutralizing antibodies, for any assay that is actually, for the moment, definitely shown to protect against disease or to protect against transmission. And that's an area where there's a lot of work going on and a lot of efforts in the scientific community. What is also known is that individuals with pre-existing neutralizing antibodies from an infection are less likely to get infected. And the higher antibody concentration you have is associated with lower viral loads and lower disease in hospitalized patients in the UK. So you can already have quite a clear view that previous infection is actually valid for protection. So here I have some graphs about the longevity of protection after infection, and this is the graphical abstract of the paper I cite here, Anand et al. And what matters here is basically, as you'd expect, your antibodies are here. The spike is the target, as you probably all know, and that's the neutralization. And this is the time of symptoms, and let's say 6 weeks after symptoms, you have a lot of antibodies and a lot of neutralization, and that wanes rapidly within a few weeks, but not to zero. You then end up with a level that potentially, in this study, is persistent for more than 6 months. Here, don't you worry about that. This is a bit different because this is actually memory B cells, and they do increase a bit later after the infection. So here, actually, it's from the same paper on this graph, and what you can see is the neutralization in individuals and how quickly it can go down or not. And so you can see that there's going to be a variability between people, right? This is again the same here. Sorry, I have the. Okay, never mind. So you can see the variability between people that are over a certain threshold or not. The response also depends on symptoms, just to make things a bit more complicated. It's been shown very clearly in many studies, and I only cite one of them here, that the response in symptomatic patients or convalescents is higher than in asymptomatic people. So you might have had an infection and you have documented it and you want to have your vaccine passport, but actually, if you have been asymptomatic, you probably have a lower level of antibodies that may protect you. And because you start on a lower level, it might also disappear a bit quicker than if you have been symptomatic. So that's, as you can see, again, a degree of complication. How do you capture that? Or if you want to capture that actually in your passport. I think the good news, though, is the SIREN study conducted in the UK in healthcare workers, which identified the amount of infection in people, and it showed that having antibodies, neutralizing antibodies, from infection, reduced the infection in healthcare workers by 83% over a period of 5 months. And so this could be, for me, used as a sort of conservative estimate, right? You have 5 or 6 months. Actually, Israel took 6 months, and reduction of infection by 83% is very much equivalent to the protection induced by a vaccine, right? Right. What about the vaccine efficacy? So the vaccine-induced efficacy is by nature more predictable than the immunity post-infection, because obviously you have an event which is pretty much the same for everybody. They have their 2 doses of vaccine, with the caveat. For example, I showed you the intervals in a previous slide, having a sort of impact on the neutralizing antibody titers and an impact on the vaccine efficacy, which then varied from 60 to 90% or something like that. So there is some variability, and also you have some people who are going to be very good responders to the vaccine and some who will have a sort of lower response, but overall is more predictable than an event like an infection where the description of the symptom of being asymptomatic versus symptomatic might be a bit personal. On this graph on the left, I show you the Oxford vaccine, the ChAdOx1 19, and you can see in red the proportion of participants. This is from a clinical trial, the phase 3 trial, the proportion of participants that got SARS-CoV-2 infection in the vaccine study. That these are the participants in red that got the vaccine, and in blue the one that got the control vaccine, which was a meningococcus vaccine. And that's how the vaccine efficacy is calculated, right? So the first thing that you can see is the vaccine efficacy is not 100%, and that's because actually you're not protected for the first week or 10 days after the first dose, because that's the time the immune system takes to actually create the immune response and to mount the antibody responses. And you still can have infection. However, there was a full protection against severe disease. Okay. Here on the right is data from the mRNA vaccine. This has actually the Pfizer, but the other brand would be relatively similar. So I find it quite nice that actually the two publications, the two groups of authors use the same colors, right? And so here you have you vaccinated with the mRNA vaccine and the proportion of infection, and you can see that at the beginning, just here you can't see it exclusion period, but here in the first week or 10 days, you have no difference. People still get infected, and then you have the level of infection remains the same because people are protected. While in the control, in the placebo groups, you accumulate over time a certain amount of infection. And here are the vaccine efficacy after 1 dose, 80%. For a certain time, and then 7 days after dose 2, 95%. So again, because I mentioned this protection against infection, protection against severe disease, but you still can be infected, it's important to mention that all COVID vaccines, well, the mRNA, the 2 mRNAs, the ChAdOx, the Janssen, so maybe I make some exceptions for vaccines where there's less data published, they protect against severe disease. But of course, the definition of severe and the cutoff may vary across studies. So for example, for the ChAdOx vaccine, there was no cases of severe disease starting from 22 days post the first dose. So 0 versus 15 in the control. And in the Pfizer study, for example, there was 1 case of severe disease anytime after the first dose. So they actually counted from day 0. So if it was there, I mean, it's not meaning the vaccine was not good enough. So I want just to highlight that direct comparison cannot necessarily be made between vaccine owing to variations in study design. So what information do you actually take to make your vaccine platform passport? And of course, again, I'm going to say you're going to take a conservative estimate. For example, 80% protection for 6 months seems relatively fair. Now, going back to that, does the vaccine efficacy number matter? The fact that it's 80% or 60%? It really, again, comes back to what is your question. If you want protection against severe disease, and it's actually almost 100% in any case, maybe that's good enough. I want to show the efficacy after 1 dose, actually. So, for example, for the Israel case, they decided to grant the passport after 2 doses of vaccine, but you actually have efficacy after 1 dose. This is actually in the Oxford Vaccine Group study, again, a very nice study by presentation by my statistician colleague. So here the vaccine efficacy, and here the time post first dose, and you can see that you have some protection up to quite some time after the first dose. Right. So what is the impact of what is the longevity of protection after vaccine? The data are accumulating. Here, this is not real data. This is just an example. If we assume that we have a protective level of antibody titers, let's say this is a neutralizing antibody titer, you have different scenario. And I can tell you already, we are not in scenario D where the vaccine induces antibodies and doesn't protect. The protection has been shown, not to worry there. I think the question really is whether you are in A and B, in my mind, which are equivalent. You have a certain level of protection that lasts for a certain amount of time, or versus you are in a scenario C where you start to lose the protection. And really for the vaccine platform, what you want to know is what is that time point where you have a certain percent of people that actually have lost their protection against the infection. And so I don't want to so much say so much about that, other than at 6 months at least, we know there's still a lot of antibodies, but a lot of data accumulating and inform not only the validity of a vaccine passport and their length, but also very interestingly, the need for booster doses. So when we're going to get that data, we will know when do we need to give a booster dose, which is also very important. Now, what is the impact of infection or vaccination on variants of concerns? And here I cite another Oxford study, which is in preprint from Engel et al. And here I'm going to get through the graph. Here, this is the neutralization assay. Well, actually, this is a surrogate neutralization assay. Actually, you're going to see that it probably overestimates a little bit the protection. And what you have here on the naive people, these are people that have never been infected, and this is the level of antibodies prior to the vaccine and after 1 dose of vaccine. These are people here that have had previously an infection, and this is their level of antibody prior to 1 dose of the vaccine and 1 month after 1 dose of the vaccine. So the first thing you can see is that the previous infection actually gives you a protection against variants of concern. So here you have 4 of the variants of concern, which is not far from actually 1 dose of vaccine, right? In some cases. And if you give vaccine dose to these people, so basically they have 2 immunizing events, 1 infection and 1 vaccine, you get very, very high surrogate neutralizing titers, right? Again, the 4 variants of concern. Here, if you focus on these 2 variants of concern, you can see that actually the vaccine seems to still induce a surrogate neutralization. And here again, as well, except for that 1 individual. Previous infection, you have a proportion that have positive titers, but a proportion that don't, right? But then 1 dose gives the high titers. What is not known in that paper, well, actually, what is not known at all is what is the level that is needed for protection. So is it just here? And in which case all these people are protected and is not? Or is it high here? And in which case these are still not protected? or or is it here, and then you can protect against this variant in these people, or with 2 doses of vaccine in naive, basically, and not against this. And so again, I want to highlight the vaccine, the uncertainty that that we don't have necessarily the data. In the same paper, that figure is really nice. Here, the figure shows micro-neutralization. So that's actually the neutralization assay with the live virus. On the previous slide, this is a surrogate neutralization assay. It's actually a measure of antibodies that prevent the binding of the spike protein to its receptor on the cell. So it's not really, it's easier to do than the actual neutralization assay, but it's not the neutralization assay. So I just want to highlight that because of what I mentioned about the correlative protection and the difficulty of the assay. In this assay, what the authors do is that actually they take really the virus and see whether it infects the cell. And these are the same samples I've just shown you. And the first thing that you can see is that if you do the neutralization assay in the lab, here, for example, for this variant of concern, the B1351, 1 dose of vaccine is not enough. And if you go back to that slide, 3551, 1 dose of vaccine was inducing the surrogate neutralization. So it might suggest that if we were to use this as the correlative protection, this level might not be protective. You can't detect it in that assay, right? Anyway, if you use the neutralization assay, you can see that 1 dose of vaccine induce some neutralizing antibody titers, right, which are not too dissimilar to a previously infection. What I forgot to mention, and my apologies for that, this is 1 month after 1 dose of vaccine. This is more or less 7 to 9 months after infection. Very important to mention in that study. And what is really, I think, really encouraging is that this 1 dose in the previously infected, then you have really high titers against these variants, right? Against this variant, again, the previous infection, you only have 1 individual here protected. And if you remember here, you had this one. You could have argued that you would have had a higher proportion of people potentially protected, but you don't know. And this is just the same data, just showing the comparison between this and this variant in individuals. So basically, the high responders are the same. These are previously infected and receiving 1 dose of vaccine, so 2 immunizing events. Again, what is the level needed for protection? Now, impact of vaccine given at different interval and varying degrees of efficacy, does it matter? Actually, I already touched a bit on that. It does matter a little bit, the interval, because you might have better efficacy. Does it matter for your vaccine passport? I would say probably not, because we're not going to differentiate the vaccines, and we're not going to differentiate with the vaccine efficacy, right? It's becoming too complicated. So I think if you take an efficacy from, let's say 60 to 95%, whether you had 1 vaccine or the other, or a certain interval, probably doesn't matter so much. It would matter if you really was going down on the efficacy and you suspect that that's going to also reduce your persistence or the longevity of protection. Then it depends how many, the proportion of these people that would be in the reduced protection and how that impacts potentially on your vaccine platform. Now, I'm coming towards my last point, really, and a bit the difficult one, preventing transmission. So do you remember my slide at the beginning about what is it that we want to achieve? Do we want to protect from infection, protect from disease, or actually protect from transmitting the disease so that we actually protect the vulnerable people that maybe can't be vaccinated or for whatever reason, vaccine access or health status. Or also blocking transmission of the circulation of SARS-CoV-2 would block the emergence of new variants that we don't know whether the vaccines protect or not, right? So it seems to me that is quite an important factor for the vaccine passport, if that is the aim. And what do we know is that the previous infection or the vaccination protect from severe disease. I think I've shown you that relatively clearly, but the carriage is still detected in several studies. And so, and even in some studies, and actually it's humans, it's studies in non-human primates, in animal models. And so the virus can still be detected in the upper respiratory tract, and probably the transmission is still possible. Whether it's at the same level or it's lower, it's not too clear. And even if it's lower, what level of lower would you accept is okay for allowing a free movement of people, which is the aim of the vaccine passport, right? So yeah, same or reduced potential for transmission. And also, what is the impact on the emergence of variants? As long as the virus can circulate in people, even if giving asymptomatic disease, it then has an opportunity to mutate, to have variants emerging that potentially are more aggressive, more transmissible, or more aggressive in terms of disease. So unfortunately, I think a key question, not enough data and not great news for the moment. So to be discussed. So in conclusion, I hope I want to finish on a positive note that the rapid accumulation of data will support the immunity passport. So identification of correlate of protection, large amount of work, and that I'm confident will be clearer. It's already quite a good number of a good amount of data indicating the neutralizing antibodies. And there's a lot of work on this. And then once we have the correlates, then it's easier to look into different ages, different population, different timing. You then don't need to have real life efficacy to actually predict your level of protection. So this is quite impressive for SARS-CoV-2 infection since a year, the data. And by that, I also mean rapid accumulation of data after infection from people infected in the first wave, so a year ago, and after vaccination, which started pretty much a year ago as well, now that we are in May. So a lot of data will be coming there. By the way, a special thanks to healthcare workers who were highly exposed to infection, and so give an easy or population to study to accumulate data about the protection after infection. Then we have different type of infection that can impact on the quality and the duration of immune response. As I showed you, the asymptomatic versus symptomatic, that complicates or adds to the scientific uncertainty. And we also have different types of vaccine, but in my mind, do complicate a bit less the design of vaccine passport. And as you can use conservative estimates, and you can actually hopefully use conservative estimates in both cases. If you want to protect the vulnerable in the community, you want to have some impact on transmission, impact of variants, and impact on severe disease. I think that's quite clear. We have it, but these two, it's not clear yet, and I think we're missing quite some information there. How do you document infection? That's maybe not a scientific question, but it's quite important. How do you document infection? And links to my point about the different type of infection. Does it matter? Do you want an immunity passport where people who have had asymptomatic versus symptomatic are differentiated? It's becoming quite complicated. And so just as a note, I want to mention that in Israel, what they defined for the vaccine passport is 1 week after the second dose, which is scientifically very sound. You do have protection after first dose, but not as much as well, actually some studies show quite good protection after the first dose, but you are quite conservative here in 1 week after the second dose. The 1 week, because after the second dose, you still have the time for the immune system to mount the antibody response. Even if it's pre-existing from your first dose, you boost it to a certain level, a lot of cells are multiplying, and it takes 1 week. So very valid timing. And as far as I know, they use it for 6 months. And also they add people with a previous infection that can receive the vaccine or immunity passport. And that's it. So that's the end of my presentation. And I'll hand over to Timothy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christine. So Yes, Timothy, floor is yours.
Thank you, Pascal. Thank you, Christine. I'm really delighted by the Maison Française and its characteristic intellectual ingenuity and imagination and putting Christine and me together. And I wondered whether we would simply be speaking different languages as different as English and French. And in a sense we will be, but I talked to Christine last week, and I think it's actually rather fascinating that what I have to say will dovetail and fit together with some things that Christine said. I read this morning that 7 people died in the United Kingdom yesterday of COVID-19, 196 in France. And Christine was just expressing her appreciation to healthcare workers. And it's kind of a revelation. I mean, we all know what we owe to healthcare workers. But I hadn't really thought of it that we owe to them the scientists' understanding of the effect of exposure to the virus. The healthcare worker as experimental subject, it's extraordinary. And of course, we owe a huge debt to people like Christine who have made the vaccines possible, done the research and the remarkable production. It's staggering if you think about all the complexities. And of course, part of the message of Christine's presentation is the complexity of the situation. But if you sum it up, there is among all the death and devastation from the disease, there is a remarkable story of good news in what Christine said about the effect of infection, but quite remarkably about the effect of vaccination. 128,000 people have died in the UK. 128,000, and you know, I pay tribute to the people who spent the last hours with those, each of those 128,000 people, 108,000 people in France. A staggering toll that the disease has taken. And the story of the effect of the vaccine is really encouraging and is good news for so many, who knows how many people. And it leads me to think that from the point of view of the political community trying to work out how to respond to the devastation, there is remarkably good potential in using vaccination as a tool for enabling people to live a freer life while suppressing in the best way we can the spread of the disease. So I approach the question with some concern to pursue the potential of we're going to call it vaccine passports. Passports is kind of, you know, I'm going to be using the word, we could have called it certification. The politicians will call it certification because there's something that sounds controversial about passports, the very phrase passport, and I'm going to be talking about controversy. But to use the receipt of to use the fact of the vaccination as a way of improving the capacity of people to live their lives, I think there's something worth pursuing in it. And I promised to talk about law. And by the way, I'm going to be talking about United Kingdom law. I will tell you about a case from the Czech Republic, and I'll have to explain why I'm going to be talking about the Czech Republic, because I'm just going to be talking about UK law and basically English law. And if we ask the question whether vaccine passports are lawful or unlawful, there's no general answer. It's very complicated. It has to do with the complexities that Christine told us about, and it all depends on the particular situation. If we ask, is it possible for the British government to implement a vaccine passport scheme? For once, I will offer you some certainty. The answer is yes, and I'll explain why. The British government can do this if they want to. Of course, I'll have to explain what I mean by this. And then if we ask the question, should the law be used to impose a requirement of vaccine certification? I'm not sure I'll get to that for reasons of time, but I'm sure we'll be talking about that during the discussion. And some of the things I want to ask Christine about her presentation will bear on that question of whether it would be good to use vaccine passports. I'm going to share my screen if I can manage it. Because I want to tell you about and show you some examples of a really remarkable feature. I said I'd talk about law. I'm also going to be talking about politics, and the two kind of go together in this field. And I'm really interested in a political phenomenon in this country that is connected to lawmaking over COVID-19. And it is the fact that vaccine passports make politicians freak out a little bit. The idea makes them very queasy. And I'm really interested in this, and I'm going to talk about why vaccine passports make politicians queasy. Here's a quotation from Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, when he started talking about vaccine passports. He didn't start talking about it with enthusiasm. This is an area where we're looking at a novelty for our country. There's something about Britain here. We haven't had stuff like this before. That's Boris's way of talking. We haven't had stuff like this before. We've never thought in terms of having something you have to show to go to a pub. I put that word pub, we're going to find that word again in big red capital, large letters, pub. We can't, to show someone something to go to a pub, it's not our tradition. The deep and complex issues, ethical issues about the role for government. There's a bit of British political culture for you, some sort of undefined antipathy to having to show someone something to go to a pub. Here's another conservative politician, a senior conservative politician speaking in a parliamentary committee investigating the pros and cons of vaccine passports. Not for the last several centuries have we allowed the state or anybody else to demand of us that we provide our papers. We provide an explanation for who we are or what our health status is. We've never had in this country a tradition of controlling internal movement. And God forbid we ever should. There's a bit of British patriotism for you. I don't know which centuries he was thinking of. In the 1350s, we had restrictions on internal movement after the Black Death, when the government prohibited peasants from traveling around so that they would have to work for the local lord of the manor during a labor shortage after the devastation of that pandemic. But it's certainly, there's something to what he says. We haven't had generally needed to prove a right to travel within the UK before. Now here's the leader of the opposition. It's not just the Conservatives. My instinct is that if we get the virus properly under control, death rate's near zero. The British instinct, there you go, it's something about Britain in those circumstances will be against vaccine passports. And you see what he was talking about? He was talking to the BBC about pubs. And it's not just England. I think you could say something about Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, and Wales. The pub is at the center of the political imagination and of the queasiness over vaccine passports. Here's the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party. As well as burdening struggling pubs with costs, the idea that businesses in pubs can voluntarily ban certain customers is deeply illiberal. Well, and he's the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party, so he doesn't think that's a good thing. So all of them, the leaders of the three major parties in Westminster Parliament, are against it. Well, here's the other major party in the Westminster Parliament, the Scottish National Party. Their leader, Nicola Sturgeon, not so straightforward, not simple. She wants, I don't close my mind, she wants to be open-minded about it and wants to find a way of getting greater normality back than we might otherwise. But we have to think through this carefully. There's a thoroughly unenthusiastic endorsement for looking into the possibility of vaccine passports. And it's not just the politicians, it's the people who vote for them. There's a parliamentary petition online, and there's a system for parliamentary petitions. And when there's more than 100,000, the government has to explain how it's responding. there's a huge response to this one saying, don't use vaccine passports for anything, apparently. And so the government is responding to that with a review process and they've had a consultation and they're going to be reporting in June. And it's not even just Britain. Here's the World Health Organization. They advise against using vaccination as a way of controlling international travel. People who are vaccinated should not be exempt from complying with other travel risk reduction measures, and vaccination shouldn't be used as a travel risk reduction measure. Notice the World Health Organization's concern. Preferential vaccination of travelers could result in inadequate supplies of vaccines for priority populations considered at high risk. In the background of all this, and I don't know if we'll have time to discuss it, is the massive global vaccine inequality. And I hope we'll have time to come back to that. So I'm going to try and answer the question, why do vaccine passports make politicians so queasy? We have in this country, the UK, we have an inarticulate tradition of liberty. I just wanted to mention the Identity Cards Act. The Labour government in 2006 brought in a program for a national identity card. It would have carried 50 different pieces of personal information, including the entire history of where you live. And it died. It was controversial. The Labour government paid a price for it. It was a very unhappy episode. And the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition that came into power in 2010 repealed it. We don't like identity cards. Politicians feel queasy the way any of us do when we see a needle. You know, the vaccine has an emotional, psychological import, and it affects us emotionally the way a COVID test does not. Notice how much we use COVID tests. To enter the UK, you need to take 3 COVID tests. One within the 3 days before you travel, the second day after you arrive in quarantine, and a third on the 8th day of quarantine. So you get we make you take 3 COVID tests, but it would be much more controversial and difficult for the government to require vaccination to enter the UK, and we don't do it. Another big important part, I think, of political queasiness over vaccine passports is the privacy aspect. It's going to be really difficult to create a form of certification of vaccination that doesn't expose a huge amount of information about you to be incorporated into huge databases in private companies or government agencies, which involve all the risks that we're familiar with of exploitation, abuse, loss, and theft of the data. And if you think about what Christine went through, there is so much information about your particular situation, your infection, your vaccination, which vaccination you had, how long ago that was, whether you had a second dose, and what dose, and so on, and doubtless your other personal traits and other aspects of your health that are relevant to the question of whether you are a reduced risk of infection or whether there's a reduced risk of transmission if you're in contact with other people. And the United Kingdom inherited from the European Union a massively, a highly effective, massively complex legal program of protection of privacy that is really at odds with the proposition that I should have to tell, again, you know who that is, the people at the pub, something about my medical situation. Anti-Vaxx culture. I think that's a part of the political queasiness over vaccine passports. It's not, I don't think it's that our political leaders are thinking maybe those anti-vax people are right. I think it's that the politicians are anxious, and probably justifiably anxious, about creating a crisis by provoking and being seen to coerce people who presumably sincerely are suspicious of vaccination. Now that's connected with the politics of inequality and race and ethnicity in this country. And in the United States, if you're interested in this, I highly recommend this article in The Lancet, which goes through the evidence of racial differences among different races in willingness to receive the vaccination. And they ascribe what some people call hesitancy. They don't like that term, even though it's in their title. What some people call hesitancy, they ascribe to a deep distrust of health systems in the US and in the UK, of government, of the institution, of the whites. So this racialized politics creates a real problem of trust. And politicians can't just say, oh, come along, everybody take the vaccine. It's good for you. Any politician, any conscientious politician in this country has to be concerned about the implications of bringing in a requirement to go to the pub that is distrusted by communities in this country. And of course, none of them want to be caught up in a scandal in the very heated politics of race in 2021. The hectic pace of the rollout, we're not even there. We're not to the point where everybody has had the opportunity. I think the NHS is giving it to people in their 30s. We're not at the point where 100% of people have had the opportunity, let alone have actually received their second dose of the vaccine. This is all developing. It's a turbulent time, and it's a turbulent time for so many other reasons. And the politicians are caught up in the economic and social and cultural consequences of the lockdown. And goodness, you have to wish them a bit of calm and peace of mind as they decide about these things, and they don't have common peace of mind. And then there are the actual risks make people queasy as well about vaccination passports. The actual risks, this is only the briefest sort of thumbnail, but I just wanted to remind, I wanted us to remind us
taking on any more day shifts.
That there are genuine.
Excuse me, there is somebody who
and it was fine when I was
have to shut the microphone, please.
and writing them in. But now that I'm creating new things. I need a big screen. I just can't.
Perhaps everyone could pick
and the week after 2 full days a week. So next week's fine. Like
Pascal,
maybe afternoon.
Claire, I think is.
I feel like this week I've got 3 days where I can't work.
Excuse us, somebody has a microphone on. Could you please stop the microphone? Thank you.
I'll carry on. There are risks of taking the vaccine, and the famous one is blood clots. I don't think AstraZeneca is the only one, but this is what the NHS says about AstraZeneca. 10 people develop a blood clot problem out of every 1 million doses. And then there are uncertainties about pregnant women, and the NHS tells you to get medical advice if you're pregnant. And some of the vaccines are not recommended for people under 16. So there's some uncertainty, political uncertainty created. And that's not surprising because this has happened so fast. This is from the European Medicines Agency. You might say it's a useless graphic because there are no, unlike Christine's proper data, there are no measurements no units on the x-axis of this, but it's a rather interesting graphic to reflect the fact that we should remember that all these vaccines were fast-tracked. I think it's right. I'm so glad these vaccines were fast-tracked. I think that was a wonderful piece of medical regulation for the governments of so many countries to fast-track. Of course, presumably it creates uncertainties about what we're up against, or the normal track would be a lot faster than it is. So those are some of the reasons why there's political queasiness about vaccine passports. Now, so I wanted to just run through that briefly as background to the legal situation. You can well imagine that there are a lot of legal uncertainties concerning the lawfulness of a vaccine passport scheme. But the message I want to get across to you is that the government can undoubtedly do it. And by it, well, I mean a scheme of vaccine certification to go to the pub, to enter the country, for employment, for care workers. The government could do this. That's my number one message to you, is that this can be done lawfully if the government decides to do it. Any of those, all of those can be done. But it all depends on the particularities. To illustrate why this can be done lawfully, but why it's quite complicated and there's going to be a lot of lawsuits and litigation ahead of us, I want to tell you two stories. One is of the Vavricka case on compulsory vaccination in the European Court of Human Rights. And the other is a remarkable piece of litigation where Simon Dolan, an anti-lockdown activist campaigner, went to court in England to challenge the first COVID lockdown. And what I'm going to be telling you is the story of how the judges refused to second guess the government policy in both these cases. Compulsory vaccination, you might say that's a lot more radical than vaccine passports. It's a case from the Czech Republic. And the reason we're talking about it is that, like the Czech Republic, the United Kingdom is a party to the European Convention on Human Rights. And the Strasbourg court, the international court that has jurisdiction to interpret and apply the European Convention on Human Rights, heard this case from Mr. Vavricka about who challenged the Czech Republic compulsory vaccination scheme. By the way, you should know, compulsory vaccination, they don't hold down your children and inject them. There's no forced vaccination, but it's a legal requirement that's backed up by a fine. The parents are fined if the children don't receive the vaccination. We don't do that in the UK. I don't know whether that's why the UK is rather fragile for the measles, for the spread of measles, or if it would be even worse if we tried to force parents by fining them. The Czech Republic and other European countries have a compulsory scheme. This isn't for COVID, by the way. It's for children, for tetanus, hepatitis B, and polio. And Mr. Vavricka refused to have his children vaccinated, and he was fined, and he challenged the fine as a violation of the guarantee of respect for private and family life in the European Convention on Human Rights. And he lost. And I want to tell you why he lost, because it's very germane to the general legal situation. Here's the punchline from this is the Grand Chamber, that 17 judges of the European Court of Human Rights, hearing his complaint that his and his children's right to respect for their private and family life was violated by the compulsory vaccination. In matters of healthcare policy, domestic authorities are best placed to assess priorities, use of resources, social needs. All of these aspects are relevant in the present case. They come within the wide margin of appreciation that the court should accord to the respondent state. The right to respect for private life in the Convention, it's not an absolute right that the government can't do anything that affects your private and family life. It's not violated if the state takes a measure that affects your private life that is necessary for the protection of health. And Mr. Vavricka said, oh, it's not necessary for the protection of health. Look at the medical situation. If they don't immunize my child, it won't really affect the health situation and so on. On that question, what was necessary for the protection of health? the judges of the Strasbourg Court, the Court of Human Rights, want to leave it to the Czech authorities. They don't want to make the decision as an international court. They give a margin of appreciation to the Czech authorities, and they would do so likewise with the British authorities. So, and we're not about to bring in compulsory vaccination, but if we brought in a vaccine passport scheme and somebody complained that it violated their private and family life to have to show their medical record to the man at the pub, and they went to the Strasbourg court, the court would give the British government a wide margin of appreciation. That doesn't mean they would say, oh, do whatever you want in Britain, that it's not a human rights matter. They would, they'd hear the lawyers for both sides, and they'd look at everything. And they would hold that the right was violated if they were in a position to decide that the British government was doing something that was not necessary for public health. But they're going to give the national government a leeway, a wide margin of appreciation. Now, the COVID lockdown, this is in the English courts, and likewise, you're going to find that the judges don't want to second guess the government on the necessity of the measures that affect the freedoms that are protected by the European Convention. They used here, Mr. Dolan used the Human Rights Act again to say that the right to private and family life was violated by the lockdown. His lawyer said that this was like putting the entire country under curfew or house arrest. So it was a violation of private life. And also, by the way, various other convention rights, right to freedom of assembly, right to liberty. And again, in a similar way, the courts refused to hold that the right had been violated. A wide margin, there's that word margin again, a wide leeway of judgment must be afforded to the government and to Parliament on the well-established grounds of democratic accountability for deciding what it takes to respond to the pandemic. And institutional competence, by that they mean, they reckon, the judges reckon, that the government with its scientific experts is better able to decide whether it's necessary to have a lockdown than the judges. They've got scientists, they've got expert advice, which is particularly important in the context of a new virus. And you know, they were deciding this in October, so it's very uncertain. Even though they didn't know it was going to get worse in October, but they did know, the judges did know, that they didn't have the information and the techniques of assessment of information that the scientists could offer to the government. Now, so they're just not going to interfere on the ground that Mr. Dolan's private life is affected by the lockdown. Here I want to point out something. Here we're kind of getting into English administrative law, something remarkable about this case. What's remarkable is that the government did it under the Public Health Act, 1984, which gives the Secretary of State for Health a statutory power to make provision for providing a public health response to the spread of an infection. Now, there's also the Civil Contingencies Act 2008, which unequivocally makes it possible in an emergency to take the sort of drastic nationwide interference with people's liberty that's involved in a lockdown. They could have done it under the 2008 legislation. They wanted to do it under the 1984 legislation because it involves less scrutiny by Parliament. It gave the ministers more direct control of the rules they were making for the lockdown. If they had used the 2008 emergency legislation, which clearly would work, it would have been reviewed by Parliament before it was enacted. It would have, and Parliament could have thrown it out every 30 days. They would have to keep bringing it back to Parliament. Under the Public Health Act, they just needed to get one resolution from the House of Commons to the House of Lords after they'd already implemented the regulations, and then it's in force for as long as ministers want it, without parliamentary debate. And no doubt, when the government advisors and Prime Minister himself and the Health Secretary were trying to work out how to implement the lockdown, it was attractive to them if it could be done with a minimum of parliamentary debate. Obviously, they knew they couldn't do that. I mean, the House of Commons could throw them out at any time, so they needed the confidence of the House of Commons, and they had it. But they wanted the most manageable, controllable political process for imposing the lockdown. Now, I think that Dolan had a very strong argument that the court should make the government use the legislation for emergencies rather than this Public Health Act. The courts in English administrative law doctrine, the courts had a very attractive basis for saying you can't use this general and specific power to do something that so dramatically interferes with everyone's liberty. You'll have to use the emergency legislation, or of course, you could always propose legislation to Parliament to impose a lockdown. The judges could have done that. It's very significant that they didn't. They didn't want to interfere even with the government's decision about the political process by which the lockdown should be imposed. And there's the moral of the story. The judges don't want to interfere. Now, briefly, if we think about some particularities of a vaccine passport scheme, I just want to point out some of the issues that will arise if we ever have anything like that sort of scheme. Private employment, is it lawful for employers to require care workers or health workers to take the vaccine or lose their job? Now, ACAS, it's a wonderful, a public organization independent from government that that supports negotiations and arbitration between employers and employees. And you might be interested in what they say about requiring coronavirus for work. And it's all about the employer working with the employees, giving them information, encouraging them to take the vaccine. And some people think that it's against the law for the employer to force the employee to get the vaccine. I don't think so. I don't think so, because the rule is that the employer can require an employee to do something that's necessary for the work. That's a reasonable instruction as part of carrying out the work. And so if an employer can establish that the vaccine is necessary for the employee to do their job, and if they engage in the right process, and if they make exceptions for people who have medical reasons for not taking the vaccine, and so on, and if they're prepared to find alternative employment if possible for someone who simply doesn't want to take the vaccine, I think an employer could dismiss employees. I'm not aware that any employer has tried to make it a legal requirement of employment yet, but I think it might be possible. There's some uncertainty for you. Provision of services. What if a pub invented its own COVID passport scheme and said, give us proof that you've received the vaccine if you want to come in? Well, that would be contrary to the anti-discrimination provisions of the Equality Act 2010 if it had a disparate adverse impact on persons in a particular protected category. If it had an inverse impact because of your age, which it might well, or your gender, or your sexual orientation, or your race, or your religion or belief. But again, even though a pub can't discriminate unlawfully, and bringing in a private COVID passport scheme that has a detrimental impact to a protected group, even if there were such a detrimental impact, the pub would be able to defend it if it was proportionate, if it was pursuing a legitimate aim that was proportionate. So there's a lot of uncertainty about whether there could be a private COVID passport scheme. But there's no doubt that we could have a public scheme for entry to the United Kingdom, although it would be against the World Health Organization rules at present. By the way, parenthetically, the World Health Organization does approve yellow fever vaccine passports. And some people have said, oh, so sure, so why not COVID? In fact, I understand, probably Christine can explain this. Yellow fever is very different. 1 in 8 people die if they contract yellow fever. And of course, the vaccination experience was through, the development was through the regular approvals process, and there's years of experience with the safety of the vaccine. So I don't think the UK is about to adopt a vaccine passport for entry into the country, but it could do so. If it couldn't do so through the Public Health Act, it could do so through primary legislation. And likewise with pubs, entry to pubs, likewise with employment. For the government, if the government wants to authorize pubs to require a vaccine or authorize employers to require a vaccine, the government could lawfully authorize that. Because of the Equality Act 2010, I'm not sure they could do it under the Public Health Act, but they could always pass legislation to do so. And then would an anti-vaccine passport activist be able to go to court? Well, of course they would, in this country and in Strasbourg. But you know what's likely to happen in Strasbourg? The Strasbourg court will scrutinize it very carefully. And if all these uncertainties that we've heard about from Christine make it a challenging question of scientific judgment to say whether the vaccine passport is a proportionate response to the public health problem, the Strasbourg court won't interfere at all. And the English courts likewise, as you can see from the Dolan case on the coronavirus lockdown, the courts would be deferential. These are courts that are not ordinarily deferential. They have remodeled immigration law in the UK. They've remodeled terrorism law in the UK. They don't generally say to themselves, we've got to let the government do what it thinks. What you saw in the Dolan case and what you saw in the Vavirchka case is rather extraordinary. When it comes to this situation, and perhaps it's justifiable because of the complexities of the story that Christine told us, the judges don't want to decide. It's quite an extraordinary legal situation of the judges leaving it to the government to decide these quite dramatic questions of liberty. And by the way, if the judges were more aggressive and decided to form their own judgment as to what's necessary, whether a vaccine passport is necessary, well, the beauty from the government's point of view of the Human Rights Act 1998 is that it does not allow judges to strike down statutes. Judges can declare that a statute is incompatible with the right to respect for private life, or the right to freedom of assembly, or the right to liberty. And they can say it, but they can't strike down the statute, and they can't stop the government. They can't require the government to make a change in the statute. So the government could bring in a vaccine passport scheme. So the government actually has the opportunity and therefore the responsibility to deal with the questions that Christine told us about, and to face up to their own political queasiness about the problem, and to decide whether something constructive can be done. But I think that it would be prudent for a government not to use the Public Health Act 1984 to bring in a vaccine passport scheme. I think the political queasiness means that a wise prime minister would want to ask the House of Commons to pass primary legislation, pass an act of parliament, and get approval from the House of Lords, and legislate to provide for a scheme that might be really valuable in the public interest, compatible with your human rights and my human rights, but politically dangerous and disturbing. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So thank you for these two fascinating talks. So I suppose that Christine has some questions to Tim and Tim to Christine. If not, we've got some to bother you.
So yeah, one question for Tim, if you allow. So it's quite interesting what you said. So we can make it's easier to make the COVID test for travel or for any other, for example, for the entry to pub, than it is for the vaccination. So we talked about the travel, but it could also be used like you want to go in any place, you can take a COVID test, right? Because these are now really easily to get.
Yes.
Easy to.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know how much tests are being used by private businesses. I don't really know. I know there have been some instances and experiments and projects to allow gatherings after where everyone in the concert has had a test. But I don't think any of that has been done with vaccination. I don't think. Do you know, Christine? I haven't heard of any project to have a pop concert where everybody's had the vaccine. I don't think that's been done. Maybe it's too early.
I think it's very relevant, especially on the point I made on transmission. Okay, it depends that the test detects your antigen, and you might have false negative, but yes. it's a very good alternative, right?
And Christine, there's one question I wanted to ask you. I can see it's really important, the distinction you drew between the effect of vaccine on my ability to, on the likelihood that I will get ill, and the effect of the vaccine on the likelihood that I will transmit the disease to someone else. But and of course we might think that it's only the ability to transmit the disease to other people that we should be concerned about. I said that the British sort of concern with liberty and this great tradition of liberty, it's inarticulate, but there's one part of it that the famous John Stuart Mill invented that everybody finds attractive in one way or another, even though I think it's rather incoherent, which Mill called the harm principle, that we should only interfere with Christine's liberty just to prevent Christine from harming others and not for Christine's own good. And I think there's something to it. I think it's kind of incoherent. And so then you might think, well, we should only prevent Christine from going to the pub without the vaccine if she's going to transmit it to others. If it's just that she might catch COVID and be ill, well, we should tell her about the risks, but we can let her take that risk. But I wonder whether, in fact, the risk of catching the illness itself is relevant to public policy, because if you are exposed and you become ill and you don't transmit it to anyone, you still become part of the problem that caused the lockdown, which is the risk to the public, to the health service, of being overwhelmed. And so I wonder what you think about that, whether the risk of getting ill in itself is a reason for a vaccine passport.
Wow. It's a very interesting angle. Yes, I think in a way it is. We've seen or in France or in England or in India, how the fact that you have Brazil, so many disease overwhelming the system, and then you actually have people dying because there's so many disease. And so actually by getting the vaccine, you're protecting other people indirectly. And I'm not even talking about people that catch COVID. You're also protecting the people that need to go for cancer, need to break their leg, car accident, whatever is actually blocking access or limiting the access to healthcare. Absolutely, it's a very good point. I agree. There is an element of protecting you, but protecting the others. And also that's why I drew this sort of Venn diagram over, in a way.
That's right. Yes, they overlap. That's right. Yeah. And the reason I think that Mill's harm principle is incoherent is that he couldn't allow for this, because if you're being out in public causes a risk that the healthcare system will be overwhelming, you're not harming anyone. You're just creating a risk. And Mill, I don't think Mill could explain that.
Thank you.
There are a lot of these questions that have never been sorted out. Pascal.
So are there any questions in the public or in the audience for Timothy and Christine? If not, I may have one, or maybe it's a comment. We tend to... Mrna, please do.
Yes, if I may. Well, thank you very much for your two addresses. It was very complimentary, very interesting, and I think, like everybody here, we learned a lot. Now, maybe it's more trivial. It's not a very scientific question, but. And I heard from what you said, Timothy, that there is a lot of inequality if we go to a vaccine passport, or it's very, and Christine has highlighted that it's difficult. Well, the definition by itself is not that simple. So you two are researchers and scientists, but what would you expect from the political side now that you have defined, given the definition and all the thoughts that you have exposed? What do you think the politician will do with all these very, how to say, you really give all the issues of these questions. So now, what would be your expectation on what the politician can either understand or use from what you said?
Okay, thanks. That's very challenging. I'm happy to leave it to them. It's when it's so difficult. But let me try and see what I can do, because it's such a fair question. First of all, I think that the British political system is in certain ways working surprisingly well, because given what Christine and I have had to say, well, politicians, first of all, they ought to act on good advice. And secondly, they ought to lead the political community, not simply by imposing a scheme that will minimize illness, but by doing it in a way that will support solidarity, a sense of community in this country, and I mean the whole thing, the whole United Kingdom, and that will not alienate particular groups within the community, and in a way that will be patently responsible. And so they need to be open, they need to be accountable, and Parliament's working pretty well on this score, partly because of the Public Affairs and Constitutional Affairs Select Committee, which is holding a series of events, and you can go on the Parliament website and listen to them, watch them, and read the transcript of the discussion, which is quite high quality, excellent input that they get from people that they invite to address the committee from all walks of life. Secondly, because of that, it must be annoying, the parliamentary petition system, where the government has to come up with an official response if 100,000 people sign up to some stupid petition. But that very popular petition against COVID passports has created this political need to have a governmental review. And then in next month, when they're forced to make a report and they'll have to face the music for it in the media and in the House of Commons, I wish they were working better with the devolved authorities in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. But the system has a pretty open way of forcing them, the Prime Minister, the Secretary of State for Health, the whole cabinet, to work in a way that involves the House of Commons and involves the people of the country through the media. So that's good. There's no guarantee that just because a process is surprisingly democratic, it's going to be effective. And the government will definitely need not just to be open and consultative, but also to get advice from people like Christine, and focused practical advice on what is to be gained. And then they need to make political judgments about what will be lost and what will be endangered and what dissension might be created, which could be a reason for not pursuing regulations that would have a justification, if not for the political effect of a loss of solidarity and to civil discord. So there. So I haven't actually answered your question, but I've just pointed out some of the important things I think about how the government ought to go about it. And then I think if we get right down to it, it would be better to have to show a certificate at a pub than to have another 6-month lockdown. How about that? That's one way of thinking about it. As long as it can be done in a way that's not divisive and has the support of the country. And by the way, if one idea I had working on this is that there are problems for the actual implementation, which I didn't get into. Christine mentioned some things about it. What would go on the certificate? And as soon as we create a certificate, we've got these data protection problems. And the data could be stolen or exploited or abused. And as soon as we create a certificate system, we create an underground industry of forgery, whether it's on paper or electronic, it doesn't matter. And I think that those genuine problems might be best met by having a very low information, very low certification system that doesn't carry 50 pieces of information about you, but only, and I don't know exactly what it should contain, but a very minimum of information. And if it contains just a minimum of information, Timothy Endicott received a second vaccine on May the 20th, full stop. Now, we know from Christine's talk that could he could be very significantly protected or not. And so that would be crude. But it might be better to have a crude system than an information-heavy system. That depends on whether a crude system would actually be useful for reducing the spread. And
which it is, I think the Israel case is quite good, right?
Is that, it's like that, is it? That very low information, yeah.
1 week post second dose, 6 months, and they return to normal life.
Yeah. And that scheme creates a risk of fraud and an industry, criminal industry of forgery. But and then I don't think most people are going to be forging them. I think that the risk of forgery might be best managed by ignoring it if the scheme is basically useful in spite of forgery. I read somewhere that vaccine passports create an incentive to vaccinate, and you might say that's a reason to have them because then more people will take the vaccination. I'm not even sure that's true. There is a political, cultural risk of sort of provoking a hostile response to a vaccine passport scheme. Other people have said that an immunity passport that Christine explained, where you'd have a passport saying that you've got antibodies because you've been infected in the past. That would give people an incentive to get infected. So maybe we don't want an immunity passport scheme. Christine, what would you do if you had to devise a scheme?
Scheme, you mean?
If you had to decide whether the UK will have a vaccine passport scheme, what would you do?
Ooh, that's I don't know if I dare answer that question, and it's filmed. I think as a scientist, your first thing is to look what is done elsewhere. Read the literature. So the equivalent is what has been done elsewhere and works. For me, the Israel case is actually quite good. It looks good, and the scheme is relatively simple. And as you say, as far as I understand, with little information. Now, yeah, they have a smaller population. A lot of people got vaccinated. I think it's I don't know. I find it really difficult.
Perhaps to give you some time to think about it, let's take 2 questions from the chat. We have a first question from Guy Fielding about the way other countries, well, out of the UK, adopted passports, and this adoption might have some effects on the UK's decisions. And the second question is about the, so I will read it to you directly from Christian Fidanowski. What do we mean when we say that vaccine X is X% effective? Do we mean X% lower risk of infection or disease than would be the case if a person has the same level of exposure to the virus but wasn't vaccinated?
No, the response to the second is no. The percent effective means that if you take 80%, let's say, efficacy, if it's calculated this way, that means 100 people, 80, it's that instead of that many cases, you're going to have 85% less cases if the vaccine efficacy is 85. So let's say the 95 vaccine efficacy of the mRNA, you would have 1,000 COVID cases in the population of 100,000 without the vaccine. And you would expect 50 cases in the population with the vaccine. Does that make sense? I hope that addressed the question. And then the other one is for Timothy, right?
Well, I suppose, I don't know. Yeah, this is really interesting. And I'm sorry to say that when it comes to countries, I don't really believe in the wisdom of crowds, and I don't think we can take it for granted that if other countries adopt passports, it's a good idea for us. But I do think a couple of things. Number one, that the British government should be paying attention to and working with other countries and learning from other countries and learning from their experience about what works. So there's a huge amount to be learned from the experience of other countries, as we know from various attempts to respond to the pandemic ever since February 2020. Secondly, if other countries adopt it, that may change the political situation. So it may simply become more politically feasible for the government to do something. That it could change the politics of the situation. But thirdly, it's not just that all these island universes, France and Britain and America and India, can learn from each other. They ought to be working with the United Nations and with the World Health Organization. And I think the World Health Organization has a potentially very beneficial role to play. And it may be very beneficial that they've been discouraging countries from using vaccine passports for travel. I know I've sort of sounded as if I'm quite open-minded or maybe in favor of vaccine passports, but I should be more specific. I think there is a real problem with using them for international travel because of the inequity in availability of the passport. You might say that a passport becomes a fair and equitable way to suppress the spread of the infection when everybody has the opportunity to have the virus. To have the vaccination, and that's certainly not the case internationally. So at the international level, I think there's a role for international cooperation through the United Nations, as well as learning from each other's experiences in different countries.
Thank you. So, well, I'm afraid that's all that we had time for today. And so I want to thank Christine and Timothy very much for this fascinating session. The dialogue between a lawyer and a vaccinologist is something very, very interesting, very much in the line of what we like at the Maison. And we do hope that everything enjoyed this exchange. And we do hope we'll have more opportunities to bring together lawyers and or biologists in general, and to enhance the interdisciplinary dialogue. So thank you, Timothy. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, all of you. And see you for the next and third round of the our vaccine passport session. We will be on, I can't remember now because I lost my
26. The 26.
Okay, so May the 26th. Okay, excellent. And it will be on vaccine passport, immunity passports, and social inequality.
Thank you, Pascal. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Timothy.
Have a nice
Pascal.
afternoon. Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.